reasonable, they were becoming too moderate, and therefore they had to be destroyed. I'll explain that in a moment as well. So let's go back first to this deterrence capacity. The main New York Times correspondent in the Israel and the occupied territories is a fellow named Ethan Bronner. And a few days into the Gaza massacre, he wrote an article for the Times, and he said, quote, that Israel's larger concern in the current offensive was to reestablish Israeli deterrence because Israel's enemies are less afraid of it than they once were or should be. And in fact, this notion of preserving Israel's deterrence capacity has always loomed very large in Israeli strategic doctrine. And in fact, this need or desire to restore its deterrence capacity was the main factor behind the war which brought us to where we are today, namely the June 1967 war, when Israel, among other places, had occupied the West Bank and Gaza. The general picture, as some of you may know, is Israel made some claims, many people still repeat them today, that the reason Israel went to war in June 1967, the first claim, as some of you know, is because Mr. Nasser, President Nasser of Egypt, he had imposed this blockade on the Straits of Tiran. And as Abba Eban famously put it, he said that Israel was only able to breathe now with one lung. A dramatic image or metaphor, but the reality wasn't quite as dramatic. Number one, only about 5% of Israeli shipping went through the Straits of Tiran to their port city of Eilat. The main commodity that went through the Straits of Tiran was oil, and Israel at that moment had ample reserves of oil. And what's little known is that, in fact, after a few days, Nasser, who was basically a blowhard, he was privately or quietly letting foreign vessels pass through the Straits of Tiran. De facto, there was no blockade of the Straits of Tiran. So this claim that Israel had to go to war because of a blockade, and they said the blockade is a casus belli, and that was breathing with one lung, was all nonsense. And in fact, the Israelis privately admitted during the diplomacy at the time that the blockade was, as they put it, only a secondary issue, and it was not a crucial issue. Well, some of you are thinking, well, maybe not the blockade, but what about the threat, the mortal threat that Israel felt in 1967, which most of you have no doubt heard. Abba Eban, in his memoir, he famously titled the chapter on the June 67 war, he called it, in his typically emotive way, he called it To Live or to Die. Israel was on the verge of extinction. It was, as they like to call it, a no-choice war. Well, the record was rather less dramatic, and we have a very good sense now of what that record was, because a lot has been published in the past 30 and 40 years. So what does the record show? The record is basically this. Israel wants to attack Egypt, but Israel, of course, needs to get the green light, or at least the yellow, the amber light from the United States. So in the last weeks in May, Israel is sending all of its emissaries and sending its security people to the United States and feeding the United States this information about the lethal threat posed by Nasser of Egypt. And the United States takes all of this information and gives it to all of its intelligence agencies, about 6 intelligence agencies, feeds them all of the Israeli information. And all of the intelligence agencies, all 6, come back with the same conclusion, or I should say the same 2 conclusions, no dissent. The 2 conclusions are these. Number 1, they said to Israel, we checked all of your data, we processed it, we entered it, and we come to the conclusion Nasser is not going to attack. There's no evidence that Nasser is about to attack Israel. And number two, we come to the conclusion that if, in the remote possibility that Egypt does attack, well, Lyndon Johnson, then the president, says to the Israeli representative, according to all our findings, Israel will, quote, whip the hell out of them. And he says this would happen if Egypt attacks with Syria and Jordan, and if Egypt attacks with Syria and Jordan in a surprise attack. Whatever data we enter, we reach the same conclusion. That you will whip the hell out of them. Okay, that's his expression, not mine. So, you may say, okay, maybe that was the American opinion, but what was the Israeli opinion? And we know exactly what the Israeli opinion was, because on June 1st, the head of the Israeli main external security organization, the head of the Israeli Mossad, his name was Major General Meir Amit, he came to Washington. And Meir Amit told the Americans, and now I'm quoting from the documentary record, he said there are no differences between the U.S. and the Israelis on the military intelligence picture or its interpretation. That is to say, we agree. Egypt's not going to attack. And if, on the remote possibility it does, of course, we'll whip the hell out of him and the neighboring Arab countries as well, apart from Egypt, if they were to attack in collusion. So, it wasn't a blockade, because there was no blockade. And it wasn't fear of an Egyptian attack, because Israel knew Nasser didn't want to attack. And if he did, Israel would easily prevail, as in fact it did in 6 days against Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. So why did they attack? Well, Israel was concerned because this fellow Nasser, Gamal Abdel Nasser, he represented this phenomenon called radical Arab nationalism. Radical Arab nationalism was basically this weird idea that the Arabs should have the right to control their own destiny and make use of their own natural resources. And in May 1967, Nasser was making all of these defiant gestures, verbally declaring that he's closing the Straits of Tiran, and he was whipping up a frenzy in the Arab world, and it was time to cut Mr. Nasser down to size. Because then the Arabs have to understand, and every few years you have to teach them the lesson that what Israel says goes, because sometimes they get out of hand. They get this strange idea that they might be entitled to take an initiative in this world. And the then divisional commander in the Israeli army, a fellow who later became quite well known, namely Ariel Sharon, he said to the Israeli cabinet, he said Israel has to attack. Why? Because Israel was losing its deterrence capacity. So now we'll have his definition. What is this deterrence capacity? You hear it all the time as this very technical sounding term. Probably somebody who went to Oxford coined it. This deterrence capacity. And now he translates deterrent capacity into a language which generals can understand. He says it's our main weapon, the fear of us. That's what deterrence capacity means. Restoring the Arab world's fear of Israel. They have to always be in terror that if they take one wrong step, that Israel will cut them down to size. And if you take a very good Israeli strategic analyst, probably the best nowadays, a fellow named Ze'ev Ma'oz, he wrote this really fat book,